welcome everyone. This is the second of the Early Career Publication Honor Developmental webinars brought to you by the Hotaling Co-Editorial Fellows as another benefit of the Publication Honor. Here with us today, we have Erin Peck, who just took off her video, but she's the fellow who's currently leading the 2024 call. And we also have Scott Hotaling, who will be presenting to us today. Scott is an assistant professor in the Department of Watershed Sciences at Utah State University. He's a mountain ecologist who studies the impacts of climate change on high elevation ecosystems, with a particular emphasis on glacier recession and the associated changes to downstream ecosystems. Scott is also the third Hotaling Co-Editorial Fellow, and during his tenure, he produced this amazing paper that he's going to talk to you today about, which gives lots of tips on how to write concisely your scientific papers. So welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours. I don't know if I have to give you permission to share your screen.
You may have to. I don't, it's grayed out on my screen.
Okay.
But thank you for the lovely introduction. And you're one of the only people that pronounces my last name correctly. So while I don't really care about it, it's a nice bonus. I think this is really cool what you guys are doing with these webinars. So I'm happy to be part of it.
It is a new initiative, so if anyone has feedback on how to make it better, please share it with us. I'm just trying to figure out how to allow you to share your screen.
Maybe make me an organizer, or maybe it says I need to be an organizer or a presenter to share.
Sorry, everyone, just a moment.
Good. My presentation, I think, will also be concise, like my paper, and like writing, I think, mostly should be. So I don't think we'll need the entire hour, although I'm happy to have as much time as we can to discuss things or ask questions or whatever.
All right, you should be able to do it now.
Yeah, it looks good
Awesome.
now. All right.
And just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on the ASLO YouTube channel in a week or two.
Great. Can everyone see that? Cool. Well, it's lovely to be back in a Hotaling Cole editorial fellowship context. I was an editorial fellow from 2019 to 2021. It was a really important time in my career, and just an important time for me. I made a lot of connections beyond my typical scientific sphere, which was really powerful for my career, but also just gave me more understanding of the broader publishing and editorial landscape. And while I was a fellow, I wrote this paper titled, very briefly, Simple Rules for Concise Scientific Writing. And it got a lot of attention. It's gone on to be the most downloaded article of all time for any ASLO journal. So that's really exciting. It also highlights that early career people have a voice that others will listen to. So if you have an idea that's similar to this, or something that you think you want to share with the world, I would encourage you to pursue it. Let me get to where I can actually advance my slides. So Rita did a really nice job with the introduction and explaining a bit about who I am. But because these webinars and other similar talks that I've given include a lot of early career people, I like to give at least some context for who I am and what I do, in the hope that that either sparks an interest for you, or humanizes the talk, or gives you some kind of background or ideas about your own job searches or your own career or something like that. So my background in a nutshell is that I've been a faculty member at Utah State University since 2022. I was a postdoc for almost 5 years at Washington State University. And really the reason why the background of the slide and why I put this up here is this is a little hut on the north side of Mount Rainier in Washington State in the US. And I lived in this hut for a summer in 2009. working as a mountaineering ranger. And my job was to help with mountain rescues and generally do stuff on the high elevation parts of Mount Rainier, which is a big glaciated peak in the western US. And this little hut is between two glaciers. So on the left side of the screen is the Winthrop Glacier, and on the right side of the screen is the Emmons Glacier. And spending the summer at Camp Sherman was a seriously life-altering experience. So I was there. I was at that time I was an engineering major, but I saw these little creatures called ice worms. And so these are worms that actually live on mountain glaciers, and they can be present, as you can see here, by the millions and maybe billions. And I just became enamored with glacial ecology and the links between climate change and glacier recession. This was 2009, but we were already talking about how glaciers were changing around the world. And so these little ice worms is a closer video of one. That tinier creature next to it is called a columbella. But I just learned about these mountain systems, and I went back to my undergrad institution, North Carolina State University, changed my major to zoology, and decided I was going to be a mountain scientist, and completely took a right angle in my scientific career, which was ultimately a great decision, but was pretty scary and felt very rash at the time. That pursuit, a long time later, so 13 years later, found me at Utah State University, this lovely mountain university in the Intermountain West in northern Utah. Utah State's a great place for studying mountains and skiing. It's a very snowy place. The mountains are nearby. And here at Utah State, my lab studies mountain-related climate issues, particularly from an ecological lens. And so we study features like, this is a rock glacier. It's a big mass of ice that's actually covered by all this debris you see in the front of the frame. And so these features are really important, but really understudied when it comes to Western water supplies, well, actually water supplies around the world. And they also might have a really important climate benefit for creating refugia or for biodiversity. So that's a big part of what we do. And if you think this sounds pretty interesting, my students and I have had a really good time for the last 6 months making our own YouTube channel. So kind of like ASLO, where this will be posted, we post videos about mountain research, mountain climate topics, and kind of day in the life videos of our research. So please check it out. My students keep track of how many people are subscribing to it, and they get very excited whenever there's a new person that subscribes to the channel. So they send me texts in our Slack channel. So to give you some context to that, 13-year path from undergrad to getting an actual faculty position, I want to focus in on the job search by the numbers. I've seen talks like this. I've seen slides like this. I think they're always really helpful. They made me feel more optimistic and less thinking that I was just sending things out into the void when I was in this position. But I applied for 21 jobs. 19 of those were for academic faculty positions, and 2 were for government research positions. And of those, I got phone interviews at 4 of them. And so 2 for the academic side, and actually both government jobs. And those 2 phone interviews led to 2 job offers. And then, the majority of them led to either no response, or a couple where I declined something after I'd already accepted my current position. So it's not like everything I submitted, every application led to something great. And also what I tell postdocs and other group folks at USU is that you can put together a really amazing application and it cannot go anywhere and it has nothing to do with you. There are an incredible numbers of chaotic forces that are involved in these processes. And so I would encourage you to not get discouraged by getting a lot of rejections. It's very much the norm. But I think a really important thing to think about when you're looking for jobs or when you're thinking about how to put your best foot forward is, what is your strength? So when you're thinking about your CV and how you're, putting together an application for a job or a grant, what foot should you be leading with? And so for me, I quickly identified that writing was my strength. So late in grad school, So actually in about year 4 of grad school, we had a faculty candidate visiting to interview at the University of Kentucky, where I was a PhD student. And we had this like kind of graduate student faculty candidate lunch, which is a very standard thing. It's usually pretty boilerplate. I don't remember very many of those, both being the faculty candidate and being the student. But in this particular case, a student asked the faculty candidate, what is the most important thing or most important advice you would give to a graduate student, like, in our stage of our career? And he said, you're a professional writer and you should write every day, or at least write as much as you can. And honestly, like, I had a wonderful PhD advisor, but he wasn't the most hands-on, nor was he the best at explaining to me like how academic careers proceed. And neither of my parents were academics. I didn't have any academic friends. So I honestly didn't really realize how important publishing was until that moment. And so I left that lunch, and later I met with my advisor, and I was basically like, hey, I want to write a paper. Like, I think I have enough to start working on my first chapter. And my advisor, of course, is like, yeah, that sounds great. Like, start working on a draft and we'll talk about it as you go. But that turned a switch. And from there, I just started writing and writing and writing. And I wrote a lot. I wrote every day. And it quickly became what I call my academic superpower. And I think we all have different aspects of our academic lives that we overachieve at, or that we really have a natural capacity for. And so even if yours isn't writing, I would encourage you to develop your writing capacity as much as you can, but really think about what that superpower is and lean into it, because it can be a really nice way to feel more confident in the academic space and also differentiate yourself from others that are vying for similar positions. But so by writing a lot, I improved really quickly and I started publishing a lot. And then this productivity quickly strengthened my CV and led to new opportunities and new collaborations. So writing, in a lot of ways, essentially saved my career, or my career exists because I focused on learning to write well and write efficiently. And that was a big reason why I wanted to write this paper. And I wrote another one that I'll talk about a couple of years earlier. These are kind of my way of sharing secrets that I feel like I sort of figured out that no one explicitly told me. So, simple rules for concise scientific writing. I think we should define concise. I love that its definition is also very concise. Being brief, but comprehensive. And we'll talk more about both sides of that a lot in the next 30 minutes or so. So I already talked about the numbers of this article. I published it in 2020. It's been downloaded something like 100,000 times at this point. For reference, all of ASLO letters the journal is published in tends to be downloaded a couple 100,000 times a year. So it's a big chunk of the total downloads for this journal each year. And I think part of that is that the message really resonates. I happened to hit on something that people were ready or interested in hearing. And also it got beyond the typical ASLO circle. And so the rules apply whether you're writing an email, an ASLO paper, a text message, an English book, like whatever, the same kind of fundamental ideas exist in all those places. So before we get into it, I want to just go through 3 not very concise points about why you should care about being concise. So number 1, it shows your reader that you respect their time. I think we've all written an email and added something like, I'm sorry this has gotten so long, because we realize like this is a longer thing than we think the receiver of this email should be having to deal with at this moment in their email inbox. And so we're apologetic about it. You should bring the same energy to your manuscripts and other scientific communications. Regardless of the format, people don't want to read information that they feel is unnecessary. So anything you include must have a purpose. This being concise forces you to carefully consider your narrative, and that's never a bad thing. And then it also improves the reader's experience. It's kind of like number 1, but I think it's worth its own point. It's a real pleasure to read tight, focused papers that get to the point give you the information you need, and they really make your reader's day. So when you're writing your paper, I would think carefully about what you're including, but also what is your reader hoping you'll include. It's always surprises me when I go to read a paper, and I'm really curious what percentage of mass have glaciers lost in the last 50 years in North America. And there's an entire review article that's 8,000 words long about glacier change in North America. And I can't find anywhere where they give me this piece of information that I am seeking out. That's the kind of thing that should be noted, early in the paper and really highlighted. So thinking about what's the big take home of what you're doing is powerful. So where did this paper come from? I think the paper itself is out there, and the rules are fairly straightforward, although we'll talk a little bit about each one. But it was really motivated by a graduate student's need in 2019. So this is Washington State University, which is where I was a postdoc. This was my office at Washington State University, and I was talking with a graduate student who was working on their first paper, one of their first papers in 2019. And they were saying how they had to cut down their paper to, I think, 3,500 words to meet the journal's requirement. And they were just kind of a little bit panicked. There was a deadline. They were a little panicked about how they were going to do that. Now, the lazy but sometimes effective and valid way to do this is just to move all of your methods into supplemental materials and just greatly condense that section. And it can be really effective, but it also can lose a lot of content. And it doesn't take care of the bloated nature of most introductions, results, and discussion sections. So I sat down with this student and we started working just from the abstract down for about an hour. We just sat there on one screen and made cuts. And I helped them cut about 500 words from the first 3 pages of their paper. And they were completely blown away, and they continued on with that thread, and we looked at it again in a lab meeting, and they were able to comfortably get it under 3,500 words for their submission. And they really had no idea there was so much fluff essentially in their paper. So I realized in that moment, and also from the rest of my lab's reaction, including the PI of my lab, who's an extremely accomplished scientist, she was like, this is really effective. And I mentioned that I thought about writing a paper about it, and she was very encouraging because she was like, this kind of skill and vision you have for this could help a lot of people in similar situations, but also help them before they get to that point. Her name's Joanna Kelly. She's lovely and a faculty member at UC Santa Cruz now. But the paper didn't all come from Joanna or her lab or even from me. So it really started from my PhD advisor. So I have saved and I was able to track down the first draft of the first scientific paper that I wrote in April 2015 is when I shared it with my PhD advisor, a guy named David Weiserock. There's Dave. This paper, despite all this blue ink, so all these changes where Dave completely rewrote a lot of it and added bullet points and really got super hands-on. And his comments, I can look at them, the timestamps, they span multiple days, they span morning, night. He spent a huge amount of time working on this. And we'll talk about this on rule number 10 about embracing feedback. But my first gut reaction to seeing this much feedback on my paper was to be very discouraged and kind of almost mad at Dave for being critical of my paper. It's important, it's natural to feel that way. It's important to flip the script though. What Dave showed me was that he cared deeply about my scientific development and my career, enough to spend hours of his time as a very busy assistant professor working very hard on my first paper and helping me with the writing. And we had a number of sessions where we would sit down together at the same screen and work on, whatever paper I was doing. And he would show me see these 4 sentences that you have here? We can say all of that in this one sentence. And so he really was the first one to get me thinking about writing concisely. And he had this great comment in the paper which is actually in this first comment above where the paper's title is right here. Above all, you need to more succinctly get to the point of your study. And that is one of the most critical things to think about as you write papers going forward. I've been very lucky, though. I've had a number of other mentors, people like Deb Finn, Jim Clorn, who's the editor-in-chief of L&O Letters, my mother, who was an editor of a newspaper for my whole childhood and life, although I didn't realize that I was kind of learning so much from her. I've had a lot of people that have helped me with my writing, and it's very much you learn and then you pass it on, and it's as important to pass it on as it is to learn. So if you do gain skill in this realm, I encourage you to take opportunities, seek editorial fellowships, give feedback to your friends, use that power for good. All right, so let's talk about the rules. This is a longer version of a talk I gave, a 15-minute talk I gave at an ASLO meeting a couple of years ago. And unlike that talk, I wasn't able to actually go through each rule individually. We will not belabor each one, but I think it's nice to just highlight them. But this is the list. And I really like this quote from 375 years ago that really encapsulates the challenge of concise scientific writing. And it's, I'm writing a longer letter than usual because there is not enough time to write a short one. It takes time to get to a concise, well put together piece of scientific writing. And often that process starts with writing it all down and then chopping it until it's down to what I call sometimes it's fighting weight. Like, this is what really needs to be there to get the job done. So rule 1 in the list is to take writing seriously. Being concise, being brief, does not automatically mean that your paper is good. You need to be intentional about the process. Being concise is not only short, it's also comprehensive. So dedicate time as much as you can, ideally daily, to just working on writing. Write stuff, read about writing, read good papers, think about how they're structured. Start reading the first page of papers that you're reading for your degree or whatever you're working on, and think about how did they set this up and what's good about that and what are they doing that you like. And you'll develop a skill for comparing and contrasting as you go. You should identify and stick to your message. The way I imagine this is one story per paper. If you have like 3 conflicting threads, or you're trying to describe one area of the paper, but it doesn't really fit with the narrative of another, and your introduction becomes very chaotic and meandering, I would encourage you to think about separating those ideas out into 2 different papers, or just focusing on the part that's the most important. It can be really helpful to get feedback from someone else or to talk it through with a mentor or a colleague, of just like, ask them or think to yourself, what is the part of this paper that the biggest portion of my audience, or the portion of my audience I care about, will be the most interested in? And whatever that is, that should be the star of the show. You do not want to have the too many cooks in the kitchen problem, where there's just all these different threads that are hard to tie together and hard to give proper background on. Get to the point. That is Jim Clorn's favorite of the rules, the editor-in-chief. He loves this one. And I think it totally encapsulates a basic idea about good scientific writing. You are not writing a mystery novel. This also goes for giving talks. I think people want to have the big unveil 30 or 40 minutes into the talk where, the audience has this big aha moment. But the reality is, because they don't know where it's going, they either lose interest or they aren't there with you ready for the aha moment. So I think it's really important to be upfront about the point of your paper and not have this meandering thread that in paragraph 4 of the discussion, you finally reveal why all this setup occurred, because it's unlikely that many of your readers will make it that far. And so this one's a little bit less binary, a little more gray area, but it's important to keep your methods and results contained. And this really came from a student a peer of mine when I was a graduate student, who just loved methods. He loved how they worked. He loved thinking about how they compared to others. He liked thinking about how they could be improved. He was a very good methods person. And if you're writing a methods paper, it's great to be obsessed with your methods and talk about all those things. But if you're writing something else and all the method is a part of supporting this broader narrative, it's very important to keep that method where it belongs, which is in the method section. Similarly, it's easy for the results to expand into the method section. You say you did this and here's what you found. That shouldn't happen. So keep your sections contained to what should be there. There are times when like results and discussion can be combined, and that can be a more concise format. So there are creative ways to get around this or to where this doesn't fully apply, but generally it's just good to think about as you're writing your paper, what is what and where should it go. And then don't repeat yourself too often. This one's also some gray area. It can be nice to occasionally remind someone about a point, like, even bringing them back to a particular acronym or something. But if you're just restating the same thing in different ways, it comes across as, at worst, lazy, at best, boring, but your reader will quickly feel like it's not worth their time if they're just rehashing the same point for, paragraphs on paragraphs. So really be careful about how often you say something, even if you repackage it. And so then for a few of these, I actually gave some examples. So for Rule 6, this is one of these. Rule 6 is avoid unnecessary or inefficient lead-ins. So it's common for these extra words to find their way into the beginnings of sentences, and they don't add anything to the sentence. So these are just a few of the common types, but you can imagine or start thinking about others when you're working on your own writing or reading other work. So people love to cite references at the beginning of the sentence, and they'll do things like, in a recent study, Smith et al. Showed that. None of that, aside from the reference, which can be moved to the end, is useful. It can be just as impactful, and I would argue better written, to have 6 fewer words and just state what was found with the reference. People do the same thing with display items, so figures and tables. Again, you can do this sometimes, but often when I see these things happening, it's just a stylistic thing where the person always refers to their figures or tables by writing it all out, and it just isn't necessary. And then you can just have these kind of inefficient lead-ins, which often have something to do with where the subject is and can be fixed by reorganizing. So like this case of, if you find yourself swimming in the ocean, be wary of sharks, can be changed to be wary of sharks when swimming in the ocean. It's more direct, it's more to the point, it's also shorter. So think about those and avoid them whenever you can. I mean, if you have 50 of these inefficient citation or figure references in a paper, that can be, the length of your abstract in just that one problematic area. Then this one is the one that I get the most pushback on. I am not going to back down from it. People that disagree with this, I think, are stuck in the past and are undermining good scientific writing. But I think you should use first person active voice. So take ownership of your science. I did this. We showed that. Not some third person viewing your study from afar way of saying stuff like, the data were collected by a researcher who did X, Y, and Z. I collected the data doing this, or I collected the data by whatever. But really, talk in the way that you did the work or your team did. It also just makes the research feel more close. It's a way to connect your reader to what you're doing. And if a journal requires passive voice or something like that, I would suggest you consider a different journal. ASLO Letters, Dr. Clorn, the editor-in-chief, and all the AEs are very supportive of this. So when you're writing for ASLO Letters, it should be first-person active voice. And then just generally, you should remove unnecessary words. I love this quote from Stephen King about the road to hell is paved with adverbs. And so what can this look like? So a lot of sentences can just contain total filler. And these are words that are there, but don't add anything to the broader meaning. They're kind of the writing equivalent of saying, or whatever version of that is in your native language or something else. But these should be cut out whenever humanly possible. They are the bane of good, concise scientific writing. So there's stuff like overused qualifiers saying that like extremely strong or fairly strong or kind of weak or sort of this, all of that. Those can generally all be cut out of a paper. And then there are a bunch of these multi-word phrases. These are just a few examples. People write things like, there is no doubt that, when it could be replaced with clearly, which maybe could also be argued could be cut out. But in order to can just be to, as well as can just be and. These are all these different phrases that can be greatly tightened with a little bit of focus. And then something that I do when I'm writing and I'm not feeling very confident about the direction of the section that I'm writing is I'll use all these transitions. I'll say, moreover, we show this, thus this happened, and finally this happened. Some transitions can be really nice and they can link your sentences together and make your writing flow much more naturally. But they shouldn't be a crutch. And I would recommend removing them whenever it makes sense. Don't go too crazy. But you can also think about just rearranging these kinds of sentence, jumbled sentence sections. And they can be tightened often to one or two shorter, tighter sentences. This is something that my PhD advisor was really good at. He could read 4 sentences and give you one sentence or 2 sentences that said all of the same things, but said it much more succinctly and tightly. Rule 9, simplify your language. Another wonderful quote from E.B. White, you should use the simplest or the smallest word that does the job. I think this works in a lot of ways. So in one way, this will help you reduce jargon. So it's important, especially as you write for a journal like ASLO Letters, where the audience is going to be broader than maybe a typical targeted journal. You want to not use any words that people are unlikely to know, or if you use jargon, you want to be sure that you define it. This is a bit of a, like, it's hard to say exactly how much or how little is perfect, but you should at least think about each word that might be jargon. There are online tools. There's something I think called the de-jargonizer, where you can put your paper or your abstract into it and actually see what it highlights as jargon. I've done that for a few papers, actually reviewed a paper that was using it to help argue for how to clarify writing. I would be a little careful using tools like that. It had plenty of things marked as jargon that I don't think is totally reasonable, but at least can give you some ideas of where the jargon might lie in your paper, and then you can decide from there what to do about it. But the main point of this rule is, in addition to counting words in a paper, you can't really do this. I don't think Microsoft Word or others have this capacity, but I would be curious to also be able to count syllables in an article, because in many cases, you can just use a shorter word and it makes the paper more readable for most of your audience, but it also makes the paper shorter. And so things like supplement can just be add, numerous can be many. The one that Deb Finn, who's a wonderful friend and mentor of mine through the years, Deb hates the word utilize. Scientists love to say utilize. Genetics people also love to say leverage. Utilize and leverage can almost always be replaced with the much, much simpler use, which many more people around the world know what that word is and don't have to look it up. And it's just so much less complicated for no reason. But then there are other examples like this that you can imagine. And so rule 10, the last rule, and I think the most important rule on this list outside of maybe rule 1, which is taking your writing seriously, is to seek and embrace feedback. So believe more in the scissors than the pencil. And that's going back to that discussion about my PhD advisor and how getting a lot of feedback can be hard to take it well. But it's important to learn to take feedback well. Know that everyone who gives you feedback has something to offer. And as you grow in your writing and grow in your own style, you'll learn to pick and choose. I mean, I get feedback from some people where they give me a comment on a sentence, and I have a really good reason for why I built that sentence the way I did. I appreciate their comment. I appreciate them indicating that I should look at that again and really consider it. But then I'll ultimately maybe leave the sentence alone. But then in other places, they'll have a comment where it's like, oh, yeah, that was a total blind spot. I should not have done it that way. I'm so glad that they made that comment. So even if you don't think someone is the best writer in the world or something, still the places where they think there's an issue are worth revisiting. But ultimately, the way you improve your writing and get to like a really, really good final product is through feedback mechanisms, whether they're colleagues and people ahead of submission, friendly reviews, or the actual review process. All feedback is, I mean, pretty much all feedback is good feedback. So with the rules concluded, I want to just touch very briefly on a question that I get a lot from early career folks and in general is just how do I write a lot and how do I make time for this and how have I made writing such an powerful part of my career? And I'm certainly not alone in that. There are plenty of people that write much more than I do, but I have figured out some fairly effective systems for this. And that would need to be an entirely separate webinar, so I'm not going to go into all of it. But I wrote this paper in 2018 when I was a first year postdoc. And it was really a reflection on being a graduate student and how my career shifted from being essentially a bottom of the barrel, not going to amount to very much graduate student because I wasn't writing and didn't really have a career in academia ahead of me, to be quite honest, to having a more successful path and actually realizing some of the goals I had. It really came down to this like productive capacity for writing and publishing papers that I developed in the last few years of my PhD. And so I wrote all of it down. I made another list of 12 rules. I won't go through all of them, but the two that I would want you to really think about are 2 and 3, which is 2, develop a system for working effectively. Think about how you work well, read about how people manage their time, read about organizational, effective writing, whatever documents. There's a lot of great books out there and papers and people that can help you with this, but figure out how you can work effectively. And then as part of that, really cultivate a writing habit. Cultivate the regular nature of putting words down on paper. Do not collect data for 4 months and think, oh, I'm really going to write that paper in February. It's way better to write that paper as you go and just make it more of a normal part of your daily life. And then I'll just note one thing that's in there, which is from a figure in the paper, which is it's a carefully, redrawn version of this notebook that I carry around every single day. And I've been doing this for 8 years now. I make a daily list of all the things that I have going on. And then I break down the time I expect to have to be productive into 30-minute intervals, or 15 minutes now because my life is a bit more complicated than it was at this time. And then I use timers. I time everything. It's borderline psychotic how I approach timing my work, but it is unbelievably effective. If you can't get started on something, setting a timer and just working on it for 30 minutes, it's amazing what that will unlock for actually starting the ball rolling on a project. So if you've never used timers for your work And even if it sounds totally awful to you, I would at least try it. You might be really surprised. You might be able to, you can Google something called the Pomodoro technique, Pomodoro. And that's kind of a version of what I do, although I sort of developed mine independently. So none of this would exist without the Raylan Cole Editorial Fellowship. I'm very thankful to Rita and Aaron for this invitation. I love still being involved with the fellowship. It was just such an important part of my life. If you're interested in something like this, I highly recommend applying for it whenever the next call comes along. And I'm really glad that you all are interacting with the publication honor and the various great things that the fellowship does. So with that, I'm happy to talk about writing or anything else. This is my lab group coring a high mountain lake in Grand Teton National Park last spring. And I put a bunch of my contact information in my YouTube channel and stuff on here. So thanks. I'll maybe stop sharing now. Or I can go back to things if people want. I can share again.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was really great. I guess we can open for questions now.
Oh yeah, and there's the dejargonizer. Rita, yeah,
yes,
you're on it.
I put the link to the dejargonizer in the chat and also put in the name of the technique that Scott was just talking about for time tracking, Pomodoro. Yeah. Aaron,
I see your
let's
hand
start
raised.
with you.
I thought I would kick us off. Thanks so much, Scott. That was great. I was curious if you had any advice for co-writing, like with collaborators.
So my advice for co-writing is someone should take charge, and someone should be like in charge of putting together the draft, and it should be the person who's going to get the most benefit out of the paper. It's a touchy subject. People get very sensitive about how they write things. You can have different styles. What I think works the best for me is if I'm in charge of the paper, I give people sections, I have them write them, and then I just tell everyone, like, at the end, I'm going to go through the paper and make it essentially one style and one voice. And that takes a bit of assertiveness. It's certainly something that is much easier to do now than it was as a graduate student. My PhD advisor was a great advocate for that. He was a great writer and also good at he somehow could tell people things they didn't want to hear and everyone still loved him, which is a skill that is, I don't really know how you develop that exactly, but he was great about he would just send the email to everyone like, this is how we're going to do it. And so I learned a lot from him about being diplomatic, but also being intentional to avoid challenges. I mean, there will be challenges with writing. There will be people that get annoyed about stuff. There will be like I have a colleague who I've written a few papers with, and he has never seen a draft of a paper that he hasn't written 1,000-word email response angrily about. He's a great guy, but for whatever reason, he hates everyone else's papers. And so it's like you'll run into stuff like that. And the best thing is just to kind of let it roll off and keep moving forward as hard as that can be. That's a great question. See some typing. And also feel free to jump in with questions if you don't want to type them in the chat. The chat is also great, but
I encourage everyone to make use of this time and ask some questions because Scott is a really great resource.
Yeah, so recommendations about writing. So there's a book called Bird by Bird, which I will find, which is just a lovely. So I'll give a couple that are just like nice ways to think about writing. So Bird by Bird, Some Instructions on Writing and Life by Anne Lamott is just like this beautiful little book about how she approaches things. The basic thesis of the book is bird by bird is how you approach things. She was like studying for a test for ornithology when she was like in high school and started crying because she didn't know all the birds. And her dad sat down with her and was like, we're just going to take it bird by bird and learn these. And so she takes that to her writing projects, which is a great metaphor, because like you're not going to sit down and write a whole paper. And so it's really important to break it down into things that are approachable. I'm going to write a draft of the introduction or the first paragraph of the intro or the abstract or whatever. And so then all those birds become, your full paper. So that's one. On Writing by Stephen King is another really, really great book about just how writing works, a memoir of the craft and just like how he writes a lot. So On Writing, and then a more practical one, I believe it's Writing Science by Josh Schimmel is a nice book about just like how he calls it how to write papers that get cited and proposals that get funded. It's like very practical advice for writing. I find it to be a little bit long. So that's part of why I wrote my paper, was that it was like a more concise and also open access. This book apparently costs $52, which seems like a lot. So there's a lot of this stuff is out there in other forms, but those are like, I'll put one more just because I love book recommendations. There's one called Houston, We Have a Narrative, which is really lovely. And it's by someone who I think used to be like a movie producer, Randy Olson, which is all about like finding the narrative in a message, which actually producing YouTube videos and working on video production, a lot of the same ideas apply, that like you really have to cull things down to the bare bones and what's the kind of focused message. So that's actually makes me appreciate his book even more now that I've tried very amateurishly to do that.
And if I can compliment Scott's answer, there is also one of Jim's favorites, The Elements of Style by William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White.
Yeah, that's another great one. Yeah, there's a lot like this one, Escape from the Ivory Tower, is one that I've started reading, which is like how to write science that actually has a message. This is that notebook that I was talking about, where I have these like manic lists every day that keep me on focus and make sure that I use my time well. I mean, that's one of the biggest things to like talk with your mentors and folks and people around you about, is just like how to use your time well and to spend your time on the things that actually matter and not on stuff that's maybe easier or more comfortable to do. All right, a question from Giselle, or maybe it's just a comment. Yeah, totally. I'm so glad you are here for this talk and have heard the message that active first person voice is totally fine in scientific writing.
Giselle, I can relate to what you said, because when I started in academia, my first supervisor used to instruct me to write in third voice or passive voice or whatever you call it. And things have changed. And most of the high impact journals will request that you write in first person.
Yeah, it's kind of an old school mentality of like objective science or something. Like science shouldn't be personal. And I think that does a disservice to scientific discourse. I think we need to be personal, especially in today's very challenging world.
While Valeria is typing, I have a question for you, Scott, that you might not be able to answer, but maybe you can think about it and give me an answer later that I can share with everyone. You won't be able to relate to this, but would you have any tips for those of us like me who speak English as a foreign language? One of my biggest struggles is coming from a Latin language, which is Brazilian Portuguese, and trying to adapt what is very much a novel type of novel way of writing sentences to a concise scientific writing.
Yeah, so I don't have a great response to that. I will start with an acknowledgement that it is absolute bullshit that science is in English. like it is a massive advantage to a native English speaker. Like it's really unfair. I'm glad that there is more acknowledgement of it these days, even though I still feel like people are just talking about it and not actually really being sensitive or aware of it or actively learning about it. I love that Rita, people like you raise these points and aren't quiet about it. I think it's important to make the message clear to in whatever format we can. But yeah, it's a really tough thing. I would hope that someone who has figured that out, like someone like you, perhaps Rita, I think it'd be really cool if someone wrote something down about strategies for that for people that with that particular language shift. Like, what are the common threads that raise issues? Like, what's common for someone that speaks Portuguese and then is writing in English? Like, I would love to see those kinds of, like, a series of those kinds of papers that are tailored to different non-native to English transitions, because I bet there's a lot of the same mistakes or issues that people run into, that people like I can't imagine what they are. And I would also love to just learn about them so I can be more aware and or sensitive about them. But it's a great question. Aaron, I see you have another hand up.
I was curious if you could speak to like when you're providing peer review, for journals, and you read something and you feel like the writing could be made substantially more concise. Do you tend to focus on that? Or like, obviously you would focus on the science of your review, but to what degree do you also like incorporate your understanding of good writing skills, concise writing skills into your review?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So reviewers are not editors, which obviously you weren't implying that, but just for everyone here, like when you're reviewing a paper, it's not your job to correct every typo or fix every sentence or whatever. But I will often, if I see a theme like that, and if there's any kind of problem that's throughout a paper that I think exists, I will note it in my kind of higher level comments. And so I might write something like, the science here is very good, but that science is watered down by the fact that there's a lot of unnecessary, content here that I think could be cut down. And what I'll often do is, I will give reference to my own paper and some other ones about like some good resources for how that can be done. But then I'll also, if I think about it and there's a good example, I'll take a couple sentences and show what I mean and be like, these 3 sentences at the beginning of the introduction, I would have them written more like this. And if you agree with that, and if the editor agrees, take that through the entire paper, and it'll help a lot. So I think it's really important as a reviewer, as a colleague in general, to give suggestions when you make a comment. Like, it can sometimes all you can say is, there's something awkward about this sentence and I can't put my finger on it, but I just want you to note it. But it's much better when you can say, like, the structure of these 2 sentences doesn't really make sense. I would do it like this. And then the author has something to work with, and especially if it's something that they might be able to do elsewhere. So give examples, I guess is the main answer, but don't feel like you have to do it all.
Thanks.
Anyone else has another question for Scott? And I'm sure that you might think of questions later on. And if you do come up with a question, you can always email it to us. And I'm already volunteering Scott, but I'm sure he'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, definitely. Like, happy to answer questions like that or about whatever.
So if no one else has any other questions, thanks everyone for coming, for joining. Thank you so much, Scott, for the presentation and all the great insights. we'll be in contact about the third webinar, but that won't happen until next year. So you have some time to work on your manuscripts, send them to us for the friendly reviews, and maybe even work already on our feedback towards a draft for submission to ASLO letters, which is due in April, Erin? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, be working on it. Be working on
Wonderful.
it now and consistently.
And we'll make the video available in a few days' time. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rita.